Chapter 5, page 126, the Federal Reserve, the power and independence of the Federal Reserve. The Reserve System Federal, the leading legislative model that the Federal Reserve System replaced, was called the National Reserve Association, the National Reserve Association. But even from the beginning, the federal aspect was misleading. The bank's very location reflected not a federal union between state and national governments, but political compromises concerning an American in 1913 that no longer exist in 2016 leave to the side that 50 state governments are served by 12 reserve banks. The system the founders created included 2 reserve banks in the state of Missouri and only one west of Dallas. It is a curious theory of federalism that produces this kind of representative result. Whatever the Federalist intentions of the first framers of the Federal Reserve System, time and experience have largely left behind the private model. Central banks evolved and became primarily public-facing institutions. The ambiguously public-private reserve banks have remained largely based on entrenched politics, not superior policy. We will question the reserve bank's status in the final chapter of this book. Their continued presence in the form they are in is one of the most important, least studied, and least defensible features of governance of the Federal Reserve System. Part 2, the 500 hats of the Federal Reserve. Should be Chapter 6, the power and independence of the Federal Reserve, coming up. This is the end of Chapter 5. The 500 hats of the Federal Reserve. The Ulysses Punchbowl view of the Fed independence tells us a story about democracy's inability to manage its money. The story has a strong logic, theory, and history, but over the course of the Fed's century, Congress, the President, and the public have placed within the Fed's walls many other functions that extend far beyond the maintenance of price stability. The chapters in this part explore those diverse missions, including price stability, and ask whether the Ulysses Punchbowl theory of Fed independence is transferable to these other functions. No need to bury the lead. The answer is no. Part 2 explains why. Chapter 6. Practicing Monetary Policy. The Rise and the Fall of the Chaperone. Our credit system depends on the Bank of England for its security. One of the wisdom of the directors is of that one joint stock company. It depends whether England shall be solvent or insolvent. Solvent. Walter Bagod, 1873. William McChesney Martin liked to tell stories. One he favored was the story of old economics professor who always posed the same questions on his final exams. When he was asked how his students could possibly fail the test, given access to past exams, the professor would reply with a smile, "Well, it's true that the questions don't change, but the answers do." Before the 2008 financial crisis, there was roughly universal academic consensus on what the answers were to an old question. What is a central bank designed to do? The answer was the Ulysses Punchbowl view on a central bank in an institution illegally separate from the head of the state, so that it can control inflation through the exercise of technical expertise. How the central bank reached this goal was also universally understood. Central bankers conduct monetary policy by raising or lowering interest rates with an aim toward price stability and eventually toward maximum employment. This answer was applicable not only to the Fed by the end of the 20th century. Independent central banks in the Ulysses Punchbowl sense of independence were deregular rigmarole. Stable economies needed independent central banks, which in turn would guide these economies towards stability by using a standard set of conventional tools. As with so much else, the 2008 crisis changed everything. After 2008 monetary policy changed, as these conventional tools were no longer equal to the task of guiding an economy through stable growth with low inflation, this realization has led to the heated discussions among economists, central bankers, and the general public about the value of the tools in the Fed's and the other central bankers' toolkit. The problem was relatively simple. The economy was spiraling deeper into recession, and unemployment rates were skyrocketing, and yet the Fed's primary tool for combating this situation, lowering interest rates, was not available. Interest rates were already at zero, and the crisis was only beginning. This macroeconomic reality, what the economists call liquidity trap, raises important questions about the standard practice of central banking. It also calls into question the Ulysses Punch Bowl model of Fed independence. Under that model, the economists know what needs to be done. Take away the punch bowl before we all get too drunk and regret it in the morning. The politicians are supposed to prefer looser money. The chaperone is supposed to exercise the clear technocratic role of tempering those tippling enthusiasms. Liquidity traps are different. After the crisis, the Fed was in the position of trying to get a bunch of wallflowers to take tequila shots. The politics around central banking had changed, and with that change, the theoretical explanation of the unique place of central banks in our government and economy. No longer was there a uniform clamor from the democracy for lower and lower interest rates that the wise central banking chaperone had to resist. The experts, populists, and politicians were split on these important points. This chapter explores these important changes. It argues that the Ulysses Punch Bowl tradition of Fed independence doesn't work in a crisis. The central bank here is not a chaperone trying to keep the party calmer than it should otherwise be. The better metaphor is a judicial one. The central banker must judge the best data against the best models of the economy informed by her own values and the worldviews. As Bagot said about the Bank of England, it is one of the wisdom of the economic judges at this technocratic, but always acting in a political context and making value laden, judgments that the future of the economy depends. How the Fed works understanding conventional monetary policy. Before we could all understand how the 2008 crisis of the unconventional monetary policy brings into question the Ulysses Punch Bowl vision of Fed independence, we need to understand more about the mechanics of conventional monetary policy, from which post-2008 central banking is such a deviation. The Fed, through decisions made at Federal Open Market Committee and the Board of Governors, controls monetary policy using a variety of basic tools. These tools are the federal funds rate, the discount rate, and the reserve requirements. We will discuss each in turn. Since the Martin Fed in 1950s and 1960s controlled the federal funds, rate has been the most important, the most commonly used of the Fed's tools. It's a confusing name, the federal funds rate. Despite its name, it does not refer to an interest rate the federal government pays on its own debt. The federal funds rate refers instead to rate at which banks lend money to each other, usually for short-term loans, overnight or slightly longer. The rate is connected to the federal government, though through the mechanism used to change it. The FOMC, in its 8 annual meetings, establishes the target federal funds rate, or the rate it wishes to see in the markets for those interbank short-term loans. To reach this target, the Fed buys or sells securities on the open market through the trading desk at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Here's the connection to the federal government. The New York Fed's primary conventional tool to accomplish the FOMC's objectives is the purchase and the sale of short-term government securities. When the FOMC decides to raise interest rates, the New York Fed pulls cash out of the financial system by selling the short-term government debt securities the Fed keeps on its books. When the FOMC decides to lower interest rates, the New York Fed injects cash into the financial system by buying those securities back from the market participants. When the Fed buys a Treasury security on the open market, it provides the bank on the other side of the transaction with cash and electronic modification to the bank's balance sheet. This purchase removes the security from a bank's balance sheet and replaces it with greater reserves in the bank's account as local Federal Reserve Bank. In this way, the Fed has expanded the money supply by removing from a banking system an asset that is harder to sell on a market, a government bond, or more recently, a mortgage-backed security, and replacing it with cash, literally. Federal Reserve notes, mostly electronic of course. These notes are the easiest assets to exchange for other goods and services. Indeed, as the notes themselves report, they are legal tender for all debts, public and private. In the monetary metaphor, cash is the most liquid of assets. The Fed regulates how much cash banks must keep in their reserves, which are deposited at the bank's regional Fed. If the bank already has the requisite level of reserves required by the Fed, the cash that is added to its balance sheet, though it's a sale of Treasury security of the Fed, is something extra. Banks are generally in the business of taking the something extra and injecting it into the economy in the form of bank loans. Under normal conditions, the bank will lend the cash it has received from the Fed in exchange for its more liquid security. Doing so expands the money supply in the economy as the bank borrower spends the money and multiplies the money's reach through a daisy chain of spending, investing, and saving. Because most consumers of bank credit, usually businesses, but also individuals, don't carry around much cash in their wallets or under their mattresses, the money first bank receives through the Fed's initial market transaction does to another bank or business, which goes to another bank or business, and on and on. The effect is more or less predictable: expansion of the money supply throughout the banking system. When such a monetary expansion occurs, bank starts to feel flush. Projects that otherwise would not get funded. People who would otherwise not get loans. The result under the best conditions is economic growth. As the lending expands, economically useful projects and expansions result in more jobs, more goods, more economic activity to provide for a growing and striving population. That's under the best conditions. Under the other conditions, what looks like economic growth is, in fact, a monetary mirage. It's not more jobs, goods, and services that we see. It's more money, just more money. And when more and more money chases the same or shrinking number of jobs, goods, and services, and prices of everything go up, these inflationary pressures threaten to undermine the economy's stability and consumer confidence, and the level of prices and wages, and have become the primary target of central bankers the world over. When the Fed fears that loss of confidence and senses that inflation, not growth, is driving expansion, the central bank intervenes. The chaperone has arrived at the party. It's time to take away the punch bowl. More correctly, the Fed restricts the money supply by doing the reserve of the purchase of the Treasury securities described above it, sells them to its counterparties. When the Fed sells these securities on the open market, at the open market price, it replaces cash on the bank's balance sheet with a less liquid asset, a short-term government security. In turn, the Fed's counterparty bank will either call in loans due or more frequently initiate fewer subsequent loans, thus either diminishing or slowing the expansion of the money supply. So far, this explanation has skated over the significance of interest rates. After all, the Fed has done nothing explicitly with interest rates. It has merely injected or retracted liquidity to expand or shrink the money supply. The connection between open market operations and interest rates, however, is as basic as a supply and demand graph from introductory economics. Here, the supply and demand are supply of and demand for short-term bank loans, a commodity for which there is a market just as there are markets for crude oil, pineapples, or squirrel traps. The price of money in these markets is the interest rate, here called the federal funds rate. When there's less money available to banks to lend it to each other, they will pay more for it, and the interest rates will rise. When there is more money, people will pay less for it, and the interest rates will drop. Thus, while the difference between the federal funds effective rate and the federal funds target rate is actually more complicated than this simple explanation suggests, the basic reality is that the Fed can and does affect interest rates, though open market operations similar to the process described above by affecting the availability of money. The Fed changes the price of money. With this background in mind, loans through the figurative discount window, the other conventional approach to monetary policy, are more easily explained. The discount rate is the rate set by the reserve banks with approval of the Board of Governors, at which the Fed itself lends directly to the banks. The discount rate used to be more far important to the maintenance of banking system. The tussle described between William McChesney Martin and Lyndon Johnson in Chapter 2 was about the discount rate. Before the crisis and the emergency lending that occurred through the window, it had long been in decline, as we see in Chapter 4 and we'll see again in the next chapter. The discount window for the implementation of the central bank's other functions is more essential. Finally, there is last instrument, the regulation of banks' reserves requirements, and those regulations that tell banks how much cash they have and to have in the vaults to satisfy the demands of the depositors. The smallest banks have lighter requirements. As banks get larger, these requirements increase until they are eventually 10% of assets as defined by a relatively complicated set of factors. In the decades before the financial crisis of 2008, reserve requirements were the least used of monetary tools. In that last sense, in the pre-crisis popular perception, the Federal Reserve System was like the Holy Roman Empire, neither federal nor reserve nor really much of a system. It wasn't really federal. Even from the beginning, these reserves weren't a very important part of its policy making. And by the time of the crisis, the Fed chair came to be seen inaccurately as the physical embodiment of all central banking functions. After the crisis, though, questions arose about these much neglected reserves. Questions like these: what rate should the reserve requirements be? What is the connection between reserve requirements and financial crisis? And perhaps especially, what kinds of assets will dictate the amount of cash the banks have to have on their hand? Reserve requirements matter most, both before and after the crisis. It's kind of a supporting actor in the conventional monetary policy story. It is deficiencies in the reserve requirements that primarily send banks into federal funds market to borrow a short-term basis until they can meet their standards. The intellectual and institutional history of conventional monetary policy and central bank independence. These are the tools of conventional monetary policy, the Fed's and the other central banks' successes. And using these tools in response to economic overheating or cooling has come to define the Ulysses Punch Bowl approach to Fed independence. It's tempting to attribute the conceptual success of this approach to the Fed independence to Mariner Eslis, William McChesney Martin, and the Fed Treasury Accord of 1951. Many do, but the idea of placing the regulation and the currency outside of the main ministries of government was deeply unpopular in many corners. For example, liberal economists like John Kenneth Galbraith, Seymour Harris, and James Tobin, the three of the most famous economists of the mid-20th century, throughout the idea absurd. Galbraith called it indefensible to have the Fed exercise arbitrary independent power to overthrow the decisions reached by the president and his economic advisors. Tobin called it a paranoid mania that would prevent the Treasury from working closely with the central bank on matters of mutual concern, and Harris more expansively thought Fed independence an insane idea, insisting that it was folly to allow the Federal Reserve to run in one direction and the executive in another. The Fed could push its views before government decides on a policy, Harris argued, but once the president made a decision, monetary policy must be an instrument of government policy, not a barrier to its achievement. liberals like Tobin Galbraith, Galbraith, the Harris weren't the only ones who thought a policy separation problematic. Milton Friedman, the great monetary, he's the great monetary theorist on the right, thought central bank independence much less desirable than the straightforward monetary policy rule that increased the money supply at an agreed on rate. And indeed, institutionally, any daylight between politicians and central bankers was the exception rather than the rule, though the 1980s central banks throughout the world were largely dependent on political branches, with only the United States, Germany, and Switzerland as the partial exceptions. The Bank of England, for example, the most storied of all central banks, was the fully subordinated to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, an elected member of Parliament who formed part of the government. From 1946 until 1998, the Chancellor could veto any decision made by the Bank of England, and otherwise controlled by the appointment and removal process for the bank's directors. In the words of Nigel Lawson, a former chancellor, the relationship between the government and the bank was simple. I make the decisions and the bank carries them out. The real triumph of the Ulysses Punchbowl conception of central bank independence came not during the 1950s, but in the late 1970s, culminating in the mid-1990s as a result of the theoretical, empirical, and political support for the idea that politicians are uniquely bad at monetary policy in ways that predictably undermine public policy. On the intellectual end, two economists, Finn Kindlin, and Edward Prescott, formalized the view that economic policy, including monetary policy, fades. What we called a time consistency problem. That is, at one time period, society would rationally prefer one set of policies, loose monetary policies, for example, but those policies would lead to consequences down the line that society would rationally not prefer. The way to resolve this problem, Kindland and Prescott argued, was to write a monetary policy rule that would allow the long-term best interest to carry the day. Almost as though on cue, Paul Volcker assumed the Fed chair as a year after the Kindland and Prescott paper began changing people's views about the value of an institutional fix to the problem of time consistency. But Volcker's and the Fed's answers to the time inconsistency problem was not Kindland and Prescott's rules-based approach, but one based on personality and discretion. Volcker and his colleagues of the FOMC changed in practices of monetary policy in a way to resolve the time consistency problem between more conservative than the average American in their approach to inflation. As a result, Volcker became the public face for an independent central bank. The view that the democracy's citizens could come up both Ulysses and the Sirens without fear of the ship of the economy would flounder in the inflationary muck. We had Paul Volcker and his team of sailors, beeswax in their ears, guiding the ship forward. Volcker's successes and the intellectual revolution in theoretical economics placed the central bank, as opposed to their other parts of the government, as the protector. The value of the currency in time, a corresponding empirical explosion followed that showed. Time and time again, those central banks with strong legal independence, focusing on factors such as whether politicians sat on the bank's boards, whether the central bankers could be fired, the length of the central bankers' tenure, and much else, were the best at controlling inflation. The empiricists looked at the legal aspects of the central bank that made them more or less independent of direct political control. Page 138, The Power and Federal Reserve. Salivating. Shit's exciting here. First is the control of monetary policy instruments, or instruments of independence. Instrument independence is separate from goal independence, which is the statutory declaration of what central bank can choose its end goals. Whether price stability, maximum employment, or something different, instrument independence means that the politicians choose the goals, but the central bank can choose how to get there. Second, the empiricists looked at the appointments procedures, one that limits that government's ability to determine the composition of the bank's entire governing body, increases the bank's independence. Third is the ability for the cabinet or alternatively Congress to punish the central bank using ex post sanctions such as oversight, dismissal, policy veto, and budget cuts. These three questions are the definition of central bank independence. If a bank has instrument independence, some limitation of the appointments to the bank's governing board, and some safety from political harassment, it is said to be independent. Of course, scholars in this field recognize that independence so defined is not a binary word. As one scholar wrote, independence is a continuous, not dichotomous. That's right, I said that shit. Variable. In other words, there are there are degrees of central bank independence. Telling you. So was the central bank independence caught intellectual in the political fire in the 1980s? Whether by a monetary policy rule or by conservatism of the central bankers, appointed a greater or lesser legal separation from the politicians and allowed the chapter to fulfill this technocratic functions. At the same time, a burgeoning, bro, it says Burgeoning, burgeoning, empirical literature can form a strong correlation between certain legal features of central banks' institutions' design and its ability to control inflation. Though not much else, as one scholar put it in Monetary Policy, macro-political economy made the unthinkable thinkable, and more it turned into conventional wisdom. While institutional independence was not invented from nothing in the 1980s and 1990s, the chaperone metaphor, of course, dates from 1955, and there were good treatments of the concept even earlier. The theoretical, empirical, and political focus of the time produced an outgrowing of institutional changes to the central banks in 1992. The Treaty of Maastricht, the established, and the European Union required all member states to adopt an independent central bank, following the example of the German Bundesbank, with legal protections for an institution separate from the national government to control the quantity and value of the currency. That is, the Europeans put into the constitutional treaty a mandate for the Ulysses Punchbowl conception of central bank independence. It was roughly around this time that economists declared that the only good central bank is the one that could say no to politicians. Of course. Now, untangling the political, theoretical, institutional, and empirical dynamics. I gotta shout out this fucking author right here. Hold up. Peter Conti Brown wrote this book, The Power and Independence Federal Reserve. I get caught up in those words, man. It is like a mixture. It's definitely a tongue twister. Alright. 1990s is a difficult task. It's not easy, perhaps not possible, to determine with certainty whether the anti-inflationary success of central bank design followed the institutional innovations, or if the causal chain works the other way, or if both the products and the other phenomena entirely economics. Adam Posen argues persuasively that the correlation should not be mistaken for causation, and there is no institutional fix for the politics. That is, the same political impulse that pushes a country to adopt authentic legal protection for the protection of a currency pushes the country to make that commitment credible and deliver the policy results consistent with those policies. This much was clear. However, the era of central bank independence had arrived. Conventional monetary policy was the strategy. Central bank independence was the institutional framework that made it possible. Until that is the global financial crisis of 2008. Unconventional monetary policy. The 2008 financial crisis stretched the role of the central bank in a variety of ways, some of which we will explore in the next chapter. It has also represented a change in the approach to the basic tools of monetary policy. Through the advent of unconventional policies, especially what we have come to call quantitative easing and the forward guidance. That's what I'm saying. To understand quantitative easing, we have to understand the problem a central bank faces in liquidity trap. Described briefly earlier in the chapter as explained above, a liquidity trap occurs when the central bank facing a recession has already dropped interest rates to zero or close to it and the economy is still sinking. The problem in a liquidity trap is how to convince individuals, households, firms, and banks to revive their confidence in their borrowing and spending so that the economy can stand up again. Keynes first discussed these traps in the general theory of employment, interest, and money. There is the possibility, Keynes wrote, that after the last rate of interest has fallen to a certain level, such that almost anyone prefers cash to be holding a debt which yields so low a rate of interest. In this event, the monetary authority would have lost effective control over the rate of interest. While Keynes didn't use the term trap, the implication was clear. If there's no real advantage of holding interest-bearing assets, then individuals, firms, and banks will hoard cash. Most economists paid little attention to liquidity traps until the 1990s. The reconsideration came from the experience in Japan. These Japanese central bankers had followed the handbook and dropped interest rates to just above zero, meaning the money was essentially free for the borrowing, and yet banks and borrowers weren't taking to the invitation to spend. As a result, the economy fell in and out of recession throughout the decade, sometimes referred to the lost decade. In response to the Japanese experience and out of fear that it might be repeated in the United States in the early 2000s, economists and central bankers began developing the intellectual apparatus for dealing with liquidity traps. Yeah. As a result, when the 2008 financial crisis came, there were already a great deal of theoretical and empirical discussions of what central banks could do in liquidity trap. As Paul Krugman put it, in an influential paper, the point is important and bears repeating. Under liquidity trap conditions, we got figure 6.1, U.S. government debt yield curve, source U.S. Treasury, from January 7th, 8th, and 9th, on a scale with interest rates 1 to 6, and over on the right we have the time dates from 1 month to a 30-year period. Here are the interest rates. The normal expectation is that an increase in the cash in the economy will have a little effect on generating economic growth. The goal for the central banker is to flatten the yield curve. This refers to the fact that interest rates on